ready to go?
I'm ready, Mr. Chair.
Good afternoon, everyone. The Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security will now come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today. The subcommittee is meeting here today to receive testimony on the northern border, Homeland Security priorities in the Arctic, Part 1. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare subcommittee in recess at any time. I want to thank you, Ranking Member Lesko, and our panel of witnesses for joining us here today. Welcome. Today's hearing will discuss a changing Arctic and U.S. strategic interests in that region, specifically priorities for securing the homeland. A changing climate has already led to diminishing sea ice, opening up parts of the Arctic for increased economic and maritime activity. Sadly, our government is ill-prepared for this new reality. I'm concerned that the aggressive actions of other nations, namely Russia and China, threaten to undermine the international order. Russia has expanded its military installations and footprint in the Arctic, investing heavily in a large icebreaker fleet of more than 50 icebreakers, reviving Cold War bases and deep water ports, and of course, solidifying infrastructure in the region as well. China has also made its Arctic ambitions very clear, declaring itself a near-Arctic state, and despite being located 1,000 miles away and investing strategically in economic activity in key geographic areas in the region. And China is investing in what it calls a polar Silk Road. Russia and China both stand to profit significantly from trade routes that will become increasingly passable as ice shelves continue to recede. The image on the screens, the images there, show the potential benefit of a northern sea route through the Arctic. According to the Washington Post, the northern sea route, shown in orange, traverses 8,000 miles from East Asia to Western Europe. And that's about 5,000 miles shorter than the current route shown in blue. The Northern Sea Route will enable China to ship goods to Europe in about 2 weeks faster than it can now, and it will provide Russia the opportunity to charge ships a fee to travel through waters over which it can claim jurisdiction. Along with the new shipping routes, melted ice in the Arctic will allow for increased tourism, fisheries, energy exploration, and infrastructure development. With these new opportunities come major challenges for us. First, we must ensure that the Arctic development is sustainable with minimal impact to the environment and supportive of local communities, including the indigenous people. Next, we must ensure that the U.S. Coast Guard is prepared to execute its multifaceted missions in this changing region. The Coast Guard's mission in the Arctic includes port security, search and rescue, regulation of shipping and fishing, law enforcement, and support of scientific research. The Coast Guard is also responsible for maintaining a U.S. presence in our territorial waters and defending our security and economic interests in the region. The Coast Guard, however, is constantly being asked to do more with less. For example, the Coast Guard has a major ice-breaking capability gap, and currently the Coast Guard has only 2 polar icebreakers, one which is a heavy-duty icebreaker and the other one which is dedicated to the Arctic operations. The Coast Guard has stated that 6 polar security cutters will be necessary to successfully execute its mission in the Arctic. Congress has made significant investments in modernizing Coast Guard assets, including a fiscal year 2019 funds to begin construction of its first new polar security cutter. It will not be until the delivery of a second polar security cutter in 2025 or later, however, that the Coast Guard will have a heavy-duty ice-breaking capability in the Arctic. In the meantime, the Coast Guard will need to use other resources and capabilities to meet its Arctic mission to the best of its ability. This committee works hard to ensure the Coast Guard and its DHS partners have the authorities and direction needed to protect the homeland. Sadly, the current administration consistently makes DHS's mission more difficult. And in fact, the Coast Guard's mission is often overlooked and deemed as a secondary status. The President has repeatedly attempted to raid the DHS budget to pay for a southern border wall above all else. And this ignores critical security needs throughout the country, including at our maritime borders. Additionally, at a time when international cooperation and leadership in the Arctic is sorely needed, the administration has failed to prioritize diplomacy in the region, scrapping the State Department's position of special representative for the Arctic. We need to invest more in U.S. government capabilities in the Arctic, not less, in order to assure that the Coast Guard and its partners can secure the homeland at our northernmost border. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the scope of Homeland Security priorities in the Arctic and recommendations to address them. I look forward to holding a Part 2 hearing at a future date so we can hear directly from the Coast Guard and other government partners on this most important topic. And now, I'd like to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlewoman from the state of Arizona, Ms. Lesko, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses here, and welcome to the audience. And I was saying we were going to agree on just about everything until you got to the part where you said the Trump administration isn't doing anything, because they
I didn't
are.
say Trump.
Okay. The current administration isn't doing anything, but that I disagree with you on, and I'll actually reference it in my statement. So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate our shared interest in this topic, and I appreciate you convening today's hearing to learn more about what the Department of Homeland Security can contribute to our position in the Arctic. As one of 8 countries with a geographic footprint within the Arctic Circle, the region is one of great national importance to the United States, and I think we agree on that. The area is abundant with natural resources, has immense value for scientific research, is a strategic position for national security purposes, and offers significant benefit to commerce and maritime shipping. Considerable changes are also taking place in the Arctic that will allow these potential benefits to be realized to a greater extent while also making U.S. action more urgent. Changes in the levels of seasonal sea ice in the Arctic Ocean have allowed for increased transit through the area, while also increasing interest from other Arctic countries like Russia and even non-Arctic countries like China. In a renewed era of great power competition, one thing we can all agree on is the need to ensure the United States' national security is in the face of growing influence in the Arctic from Russia and China. As commerce grows in the region, U.S. interests and freedom of navigation must be protected if we are to fully realize the potential opportunities in a changing Arctic. The United States Coast Guard has a diverse range of missions as a component of the Department of Homeland Security, and recently I was able to tour with them, and it was a great experience. Drug interdiction, environmental enforcement, search and rescue, as well as port security are all responsibilities of the United States Coast Guard. The Coast Guard is also the sole owner and operator of the United States Polar Capable Fleet, and thus best placed to facilitate the United States' sovereign presence in the Arctic. And yet, as the chairman has noted, the United States Coast Guard relies on a single, aging, heavy icebreaker, the Polar Star, to conduct polar operations. As with any aging platform, the Solar Star suffers from frequent mechanical issues that can result in the need for maintenance at sea. In an attempt to remedy this situation, Congress, with the support of President Trump, enacted funding for the first new polar icebreaker in last year's appropriations. While funding a new heavy icebreaker is an important first step, it is imperative that this action is only the beginning of our nation's Arctic conversation. The Coast Guard stated a need for 3 new heavy polar security cutters and 3 medium polar security cutters in 2013. Since then, we have funded the first heavy polar security cutter, as well as the Trump administration has financed long lead time materials for the second cutter. To maintain the United States position in the Arctic during this dynamic period, we must consider the benefits of our Arctic activity beyond just the military. We must recognize the importance of this mission and continue to direct our attention and investment to the Arctic region if we want to continue our sovereign presence. With renewed Coast Guard capability and continued national focus in the Arctic region, our usage and presence will continue to grow through increased commerce, research, and even tourism as we are able to transit more of the Arctic Ocean for longer periods of time. That is what we will need in order to truly bolster our presence in the Arctic region as other great powers like Russia and China seek to project their own. This is a complex problem that requires complex solutions to achieve our nation's desired result. Many scholarly organizations are focused on this issue. We'll hear from some today. And I look forward to hearing from you guys today. Whether that solution is continued investment, interagency efforts, existing international initiatives, or new international initiatives, Congress must set a new course for U.S. focus on the Arctic. So again, thank you for being here today. I look forward to hearing more about this. I wish more people were here because I guess we're going to have the secret and be able to solve it together. Mr. Correa.
Ms. Lesko, I think you might have just come up with a solution, the less the better, to fix this problem. But with that being said, I'd like to also welcome our ranking member of the Homeland Security Full Committee, and that's Representative Rogers from the good state of Alabama. I'd like to recognize him for an opening statement. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Correa, and I appreciate you holding this important hearing, and I appreciate the leadership of Ranking Member Lesko on this important issue. It is critical that we recognize the growing strategic importance of the Arctic to the U.S. interest. Russia and China are making significant investments in the Arctic. To them, the Arctic is a new battlefield where they are seeking every advantage over the United States. The United States must not be caught flat-footed. To defend our national security, homeland security, and sovereignty, we must make needed investments in Arctic infrastructure. To that end, I'm pleased that Congress has funded 1 new polar security cutter for the Coast Guard and has appropriated funding for long lead materials for a second. These heavy icebreakers are long overdue, and once delivered will greatly improve the Coast Guard's capabilities and presence in the region. I thank each of the witnesses for appearing before this committee today to help improve our understanding of the homeland security implications of changing Arctic, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers. Other members of the committee are reminded that under committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. Now, I would like to welcome the panel of witnesses. Our first witness, Dr. Michael Sfara, is the director of the Polar Institute and Global Risk and Resilience Program at the Wilson Center. His work is focused on changing geography in the Arctic and the impacts of social and political regimes in the region. Welcome, sir. You have 5 minutes for statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Lesko and members of the committee. As the chairman noted, I'm the director of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Polar Institute and Global Risk and Resilience Program. Members, today we are witnessing the opening of a new ocean, a 4th accessible maritime border for the United States. The Arctic Ocean joins the Atlantic Ocean, Gulf of Mexico, and the Pacific Ocean as a critical geographic component of our country's maritime ring of security and opportunity. Spanning nearly 5.5 million square miles, the Arctic Ocean covers an area roughly 1.5 times the United States and half the size of the African continent. It is a region we cannot ignore. My testimony provides an overview of key issues facing the U.S., other Arctic and non-Arctic nations. I'd like to reconceptualize the risks, the realities, and the opportunities in the Arctic. I provide a new framework called Navigating the Arctic's 7 Cs. The Cs are climate, commodities, commerce, connectivity, communities, cooperation, and competition. To effectively protect the homeland by addressing the challenges and opportunities of a transformed Arctic, the United States must thoroughly consider how it navigates the Arctic's 7 Cs. The first C is climate. You'll hear more about that in a moment. But climate change is real, it is rapid, and it is palpable. According to NASA, September Arctic Ocean ice extent has decreased from about 3 million square miles in 1980 to less than 2 million square miles this month. The latest IPCC report found with high confidence that the Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times as fast as the rest of the planet. The second C is commodities. According to the USGS, the Arctic is estimated to hold 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas. The increased availability of these resources due to the rapid thaw in the Arctic has re-energized the global market's interest in the Arctic. This interest is predicted to endure, particularly in the wake of the recent attack on the Saudi Arabian oil facilities. The third C is commerce. Russia's Yamal Peninsula is now emblematic of the new global Arctic. For example, China owns nearly 30% of the initial Yamal LNG project, and Arctic LNG tankers are built in the shipyards of South Korea. Meanwhile, the U.S. does not have a major deepwater port along 1,500 nautical miles of its Arctic coastline, from Dutch Harbor to Prudhoe Bay along the North Slope. Without a viable deepwater port or strings of ports in the U.S. Arctic, commerce, search and rescue, and national security interests will not be met. The June 2019 National Defense Authorization Act includes, quote, requirements to locate and designate one or more U.S. strategic ports. The fourth C, connectivity. We tend to think of connectivity just as an internet connection, but we should focus on a broader application of connectivity, addressing both digital and physical infrastructure. We do not have a digital or information divide in America's Arctic. We have a digital and information abyss. Less than 5% of the U.S. maritime Arctic is charted to modern international standards. We lack the basic information about our Arctic domain. Insufficient access to reliable internet connectivity hinders education, commerce, search and rescue, and impedes informed infrastructure development and maintenance. The fifth C is communities. The transformation of the Arctic most acutely affects communities in the region. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has identified 31 Alaskan communities as seriously threatened by environmental change and the imminent need for relocation. These threatened communities are similar perhaps to those in New Orleans or even a future Miami. 6, cooperation. For over 2 decades, the Arctic Council, a consensus-driven body, has fostered and maintained international dialogue, research efforts, and binding agreements among the members, including Russia. Cooperation also exists within the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, with representation from each Arctic nation. The Arctic region is the only place, aside from the International Space Station, where the U.S. and Russia have maintained long-term cooperation, even in times of high tension. And finally, Mr. Chairman, my final C is competition. The ability to project power in the Arctic can be measured in a number of ways, including a nation's ability to operate in the region. China, which in 2019, as you noted, proclaimed itself a near-Arctic state, and Mr. Chairman, I'm a geographer. They are not a near-Arctic state. Currently has 4 icebreakers and is developing 2 new icebreakers, 1 nuclear-powered. Russia operates, as you noted, over 50 icebreakers with 6 under construction and 12 more planned. Russia is also revitalizing Soviet-era military installations and establishing new assets along its northern sea route, with new military bases from Franz Josef Land to Wrangel Island. This denotes Russia's intent and ability to maintain premier influence in the Arctic. The U.S. government, by comparison, as you noted, has 2 icebreakers and is cannibalizing parts of the dry dock Polar Sea to maintain 1 single heavy icebreaker, the Polar Star. The recent funding for an additional U.S. icebreaker, or Polar Security Cutter, is a step forward. The U.S. Coast Guard's 2019 Arctic Strategic Outlook describes the need for 6 new Polar Security Cutters, which will help support our homeland security requirements and provide much-needed domain presence. We should share a sense of urgency to see our Polar Security Cutter fleet fully funded and in service sooner rather than later. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, we often hear that the Arctic is an emerging issue. I disagree. The Arctic has emerged. As I have explained, it is no longer an isolated, remote region. Rather, it is a critical component of our global political, economic, social, physical, and security landscape. The region is experiencing rapid and dynamic change, and these 7 unique drivers, these Arctic 7 Cs, help frame these pressing global issues in a way that may help to better understand and address our future Arctic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Straga. And now our next witness, Dr. Abby Tingstad, the Associate Research Department Director of the Engineering and Applied Sciences at the RAND Corporation. Dr. Tingstad has authored a number of publications on the Arctic, and she has done extensive research on the Coast Guard capabilities, international cooperation, and the changing strategic environment in the Arctic. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Lesko, and other distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. We have known for many years that the Arctic region is sensitive to environmental shifts, and today it is experiencing one of the most rapid rates of climate change in the world. These changes in the Arctic have created both homeland security and international issues. The northern rim of the United States is already an area of concern for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, search and rescue, and environmental protection. In the future, trafficking and terrorism-related problems could arise as well. In addition, the Arctic presents possibilities for both engagement and conflict with Russia and China in and near U.S. territory. Why does climate change in the Arctic matter, and what could the United States do about it from a security perspective? In the past, vast, harsh conditions, persistent sea ice, and limited opportunities for economic development have served as a deterrent to presence in the region. Climate is changing patterns of physical access to the Arctic. Maritime access is increasing, although unevenly, and land-based access in some areas is also decreasing. But climate is not the sole driver of change in the Arctic. For example, technology is also very important. New sensors and autonomous vehicles, for example, could increase the accessibility of the Arctic across land, sea, and air. And other change factors also motivate or discourage access to the region, such as the availability and cost of energy resources, as well as indigenous autonomy and partnerships. Among others, Russia and China are definitely taking advantage of opportunities in the Arctic. Russia is revitalizing fixed and mobile infrastructure for commercial and military use. For its part, China has been promoting the Polar Silk Road and engaging in Arctic affairs through the Arctic Council, among other things. Our work on the durability of Arctic cooperation among stakeholders revealed that an increase in maritime safety and security incidents might be most likely to bring Arctic security into question for the U.S. Examples of such incidents include maritime vessel collisions, dark vessels engaging in illegal fishing or drug running, oil spills, and acts of terrorism or piracy. Nations that appear to lack adequate capabilities to prevent and respond to these types of incidents will face a real or perceived security void in the Arctic. This will result in both domestic and international consequences, to include potential declines in well-being for indigenous communities, and a security void might also allow other nations, notably China and Russia, to justify an increase in presence and influence in the region. Now that environmental access barriers are falling, we must ask, how does climate change alter the needs and abilities of the U.S. government to carry out responsibilities and use its authorities in the Arctic? Ultimately, the United States must decide on the right level of national capability, and by virtue of its history and authorities, the U.S. Coast Guard will play a large role in any steps towards enhancing governance in the region. In our work on U.S. Coast Guard capabilities, several assets arose in our analysis as being particularly pertinent to Arctic operations. In addition to existing and planned icebreakers, these include helicopters, aircraft, airfields, national security cutters, medical evacuation capabilities, satellite and other communication networks, rescue coordination centers, and various types of specialist personnel, as well as data. Importantly, no single one of these capabilities arose as a silver bullet, and there are also many gaps still existing for the Coast Guard and others in the Arctic as well, to include communications, domain awareness, and response. Specific types of mitigation options that we identified in our work include a diverse range, including items such as communications infrastructure, remotely controlled air, sea, and amphibious craft for domain awareness, updating data gathering and database construction processes to enable fusion of information, and sustaining both longer-term operations as well as agile first response capability, among a series of other things. It is important to recognize that concerns about Arctic security and closing capability gaps are more than just Coast Guard issues. They are matters of national relevance. In addition to taking specific actions outlined, such as those I've just mentioned, the U.S. has the opportunity to continue work with the Arctic Council and Arctic Coast Guard Forum. Finding ways to keep discussion channels open for important military security communications is also vital. The United States might also reconsider ratifying the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is a time for the United States to continue engaging in the Arctic. I'll conclude by saying that fixing the security void includes providing prevention and response services that Americans expect from their government, whether they live in Los Angeles, Houston, New York, or Utqiagvik, Alaska. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tingstedt, for your comments. Now I'd like to call Dr. Victoria Herman, who is the President and Managing Director of the Arctic Institute, for 5 minutes of comments. Dr. Herman is research focused on human development and resource economies. She was a fellow at the National Academies of Science and is a Fulbright Scholar. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Lesko, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this afternoon. As the President and Managing Director of a regional Arctic think tank, my research aims to identify the gaps in federal support to enhance Arctic security, to augment emergency response, and to assist coastal Arctic villages in adapting to the impacts of climate change that we can no longer avoid. However, I live in Washington, D.C., and therefore I cannot observe the day-to-day coastal and marine changes along Arctic coastlines that are the most immediate threat to our northern border. And so, when I was invited to this hearing, I reached out to colleagues in Alaska, from the Norton Sound to Bristol Bay, with a question: what is the most critical maritime security issue we should discuss here? Today, my testimony is guided by the many Indigenous and local Arctic experts I have listened to and learned from. If there is one takeaway message from their messages, it is this: for America's northernmost citizens, for the world's northernmost residents, climate change is already a life-threatening, everyday reality. The most recent NOAA Arctic Report Card delivered an unambiguous finding. The impacts of climate change are already forcing the region to undergo an unprecedented transition. Arctic air and sea temperatures are warming at more than twice the rate of the global average. The Arctic Ocean has lost 95% of its oldest documented sea ice. This new, more dangerous normal poses the greatest threat to human safety, to marine ecosystems, and to our capacity to respond to maritime emergencies. In September 2016, I first traveled to Nome, Alaska, a remote port city of 3,500 residents just south of the Arctic Circle. Through my research, I had the privilege of interviewing 20 local leaders to discuss how the settlement's infrastructure, population, and port are coping with the consequences of a changing climate. I believe that these interviews provide critical perspectives to support informed committee deliberations through 3 key findings. The first, Arctic coastal residents are the first responders to any maritime security threat. As Austin Amosuk, a lifelong Inupiat hunter and community advocate, noted in his interview, quote, as we looked at how things like oil or hazardous spills are treated in this region, we came to a very dramatic realization. We are the first responders, and we have few response assets to ensure healthy environments. Annually, 14,000 to 18,000 gallons of spilled oil or hazardous substances occur in this region. We know our homelands and home waters, but over the last 2 years, we have not been able to speak at the table for our lands and waters, end quote. Disaster response and search and rescue capabilities are only as strong as the commitments to communication channels, technical commitments, and infrastructure investments to support collaboration with community first responders on our nation's Arctic coastlines. Better integrating and enhancing community-based observing networks as part of the Arctic Domain Awareness Center, a DHS Center of Excellence, offers one opportunity to address this issue if it is done in a way that makes local leaders feel valued and included in upfront decision-making. 2, climate change is creating significant economic costs to U.S. coastal settlements and some local economic opportunity. However, at present, local economies are overburdened by costs and are unable to capture economic gains due to a lack of strategic investment in infrastructure. This is perhaps best grounded by lifelong Bristol Bay commercial fisherman Britt Verheusen. Quote, "The Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands are some of the richest fishing grounds on Earth, contributing to American and the world's food security. Increased vessel traffic through the Arctic poses both opportunities and challenges for our fishing fleets. But those challenges can be devastating if we cannot respond quickly to emergencies and protect those fisheries." The third and final point, Arctic residents that act as first responders are living in a continual state of emergency from climate impacts. Coastal communities are facing threats to public safety, to food security, and traditional livelihoods from changing terrestrial and marine ecosystem conditions. Threats to human security in U.S. Arctic towns, villages, and cities must be integrated into investments and policy decisions for a secure northern homeland. Just this morning, a news headline read, "Summer 2019 was hellish for the Arctic, the front line of climate change." The Arctic has generated more crisis headlines like this than any other region. Nonetheless, in Mr. Amontsuk's words, we struggle mightily to have our voices heard. The hearing today is absent of many voices of community first responders and Indigenous knowledge holders. It is incumbent upon us here in Washington, D.C. to work harder to bring their voices to this table and to reach further to meet them at their tables above the Arctic Circle through field visits and hearings. As we work towards that goal of building a more inclusive dialogue on maritime security and economic investment in transportation, I urge us all to consider how we can ensure every Arctic conversation and legislation is guided by those local leaders and made with reference to the climate impacts already costing billions of dollars in damages, multiplying security threats, and devastating traditional maritime livelihoods, not only for the 4 million people that call the Arctic home, but for communities across America. Because what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic, it affects us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Herman, for your testimony. And our final witness is Mr. Lou Coffey, who is the director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to joining the Heritage Foundation, Mr. Coffey served in the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense as Special Advisor to then Secretary of State for Defense, where he worked on Arctic security issues. He served as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army and was awarded the Bronze Star. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for that introduction. Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Lesko, and distinguished members of the committee, I am honored to speak before this committee today about Arctic security issues. With your permission, Mr. Chairman, I will summarize my prepared statement that has been submitted for the record.
Please.
Increased economic activity in the Arctic due to advancements in technology and reduced ice will likely lead to a larger military presence. This isn't because there's a heightened threat of conflict in the region, but many of the capabilities needed in the Arctic, such as search and rescue, are more immediately, and at least for now, more effectively provided by the military and the Coast Guard. Reduced ice in the summer months means new shipping lanes, increased tourism, further natural resource exploration, but these changes, in my opinion, will take time and should be put into perspective. For example, the Northern Sea Route that is often touted as a future rival to the Suez Canal has, interestingly, last year only 18 million tons of goods transited along that route. Of this, only 491,000 tons made the full journey from Europe to Asia. This is 0.04% of the volume of goods that transited through the Suez Canal during the same year. So far, the Trump administration has been a mixed bag when it comes to Arctic policy. On a positive note, Secretary Pompeo's visit to Iceland was the first cabinet-level visit to that country in more than a decade, and it ended the Obama administration's diplomatic sanctions on that country over the issue of whaling. Also, the administration recently announced the opening of a part-time diplomatic presence in Greenland, and this is something the Heritage Foundation has been calling for. However, there have been some shortcomings. The unwillingness of the U.S. to agree to a joint statement during the 2019 Arctic Council ministerial over the issue of climate change was unfortunate. And sometimes America's voice is missing in the debate. At last year's Arctic Circle Assembly in Iceland, U.S. government officials could not be seen. They certainly were not heard, and those of us that were there know that China happily filled this void. And I'm grateful that this year Secretary Perry will be giving the keynote address at that event. Mr. Chairman, today the U.S. has 4 primary security interests in the Arctic. Firstly, ensuring the territorial defense of the United States. In this sense, our relationship with Canada is vital. And relations with Iceland and Greenland are also important because these 2 countries are essentially the forward operating bases of the North American continent. Secondly, enforcing U.S. sovereignty in the region. In the Arctic, sovereignty equals security and stability. This means respecting the sovereignty of others while maintaining the ability to enforce one's own sovereignty. This will reduce the chances of armed conflict and ensure that tensions remain low in the region. Thirdly, meeting our treaty obligations in the Arctic through NATO. 5 of the world's 8 Arctic countries belong to NATO, but the alliance has no agreed policy on the region, and this needs to change. Finally, ensuring the free flow of shipping and other economic activities in the region. After all, economic freedom tends to lead to prosperity and security. Mr. Chairman, while the military threat in the Arctic remains low, U.S. policymakers cannot ignore Russia and China's role there. Both directly impact America's ability to meet its security interests in the region. Russia's recent steps to militarize the region is a concern. Russia has invested greatly in its Arctic footprint by building or refurbishing dozens of bases. The Arctic-based Northern Fleet accounts for 2/3 of the Russian Navy. An Arctic Command was established in 2015 to coordinate all Russian military activities in the region. Russia can do as it likes inside its own borders, but it is Moscow's actions in places like Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria that makes Russia's motives in the Arctic questionable. In the simplest terms, China sees its role in the Arctic as a place where it can expand its economic influence and diplomatic interests. But considering the problems China has created in places like Djibouti or Sri Lanka, there are reasons to be worried. Beijing's Arctic strategy offers a useful glimpse in how it wants the rest of the world to see the role of China in the region. Running 5,500 words long in the English language version, the strategy is littered with all the popular Arctic buzz phrases: common interests of all countries, law-based governance, climate change, sustainable development. The irony is not lost on observers of the South China Sea, where China has shunned international norms to exert dubious claims of sovereignty, or by the fact that China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Even though China's closest point to the Arctic Circle is more than 800 nautical miles away, as you can see on the screen, Beijing refers to itself as a near-Arctic state, which is a term that it's completely made up. Extending Beijing's logic to other countries would mean that Kazakhstan, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Ireland are also near-Arctic states, and these aren't countries we normally associate with the Arctic. In conclusion, I want to highlight some of the challenges of operating militarily in the region. Equipment has to be hardened for extreme cold weather. High-frequency radio signals can be degraded due to magnetic and solar phenomena. GPS can be degraded due to poor satellite geometry. And some of Alaska's shipping lanes have not been surveyed properly since Captain James Cook sailed through in 1778. This is why proper investment in the region by the Coast Guard and the DoD is so important. This is not about preparing for war. This is about just preparing for the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony. And without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted into the record. I remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes of questions for for the panel, and I would like to recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Your testimony, to all of you, covered a great deal in terms of the challenges to our country and to our government in the Arctic, and I would ask, what do you see as the single biggest challenge facing the United States and the Coast Guard in the Arctic? If each one of you could answer that question.
Perhaps, Mr. Chairman, I will start because I know my colleagues will have many other items. But to me, it's this idea of domain awareness. If we don't have basic charting, as was pointed out, if we don't know the domain in which we're to operate, we simply can't do it efficiently. You can't build a port, you can't ship oil and gas, you can't develop an Arctic, you can't protect communities, you can't forecast what coastlines would look like unless we have fully charted the U.S. oceans, including the Arctic, around our region, especially in Alaska. And as was noted, those are lacking considerably. So I think that is one significant area of good hydrological surveys of our territory, because even if you have Coast Guard cutters and you want to put in ports, you still won't know what terrain you're dealing with unless you have basic data. So I would support the research related to hydrological charting and surveying.
Yes.
I don't disagree with that at all, but I would characterize the problem maybe according to a slightly larger scope, which is this issue of a potential security void, perceived or real, coming about because if the U.S. is not able to provide the prevention and response capabilities required in the Arctic as they are elsewhere across the United States. And I think that domain awareness is certainly a big part of that. So too are communications and response capabilities, to include the icebreakers, but I want to highlight that our research did find that it really takes a portfolio of capabilities. So although icebreakers are important, for example, and so too is charting, there are a suite of capabilities that the Coast Guard, for example, will need to operate effectively in the region. Thank you.
Dr. Herman?
I would add robust partnerships. As you, Chairman Correa, said in your opening remarks, the U.S. Coast Guard is forced to do more with less, and some of that could be augmented by providing more partnerships with scientific institutions to increase our charting, partnerships with those first responders in Alaska Native communities all along the coastlines, more partnerships in the international arena, as Mr. Coffey noted, about a lack of engagement.
So let me interrupt you. Statements were made that we have traditionally had good relations, cooperation with the Russians, two places, in space and in the Arctic. So do we concur that given that cooperation can become competition, that can become friction, because now you're just not talking about a frozen Iceland, you're talking about major resources. Do we see ourselves going in that direction?
I think we could if we don't provide robust partnerships. We have, since the fall of the Iron Curtain, since the fall of the Cold War, seen the Arctic as a peaceful region, and we have tried very hard through the Arctic Council to ensure that that has still been the case. However, when we don't invest in our allies through those partnerships in Scandinavia, if we don't invest in those partnerships with Canada...
Running out of time, let me have Mr. Coffey say a few words on that. Thank you very much, Dr. Herman.
I agree with the issue about situational awareness, so I have nothing to add in terms of what was already said, but I will say one thing about our lack of awareness of the fact that we are an Arctic country. Outside committee rooms like this or certain offices and certain think tanks around town, there seems to be this inability to grasp the idea that we are an Arctic country, being so far away from it where we are.
Thank you very much. I'm going to now recognize a ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleperson from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question will be for Mr. Sfraga. Is that how you say your name? Thank you. And by the way, I read your testimonies, all of yours, and very interesting. Good job. Can you describe China's Polar Silk Road Initiative and its significance to the changing dynamic in the Arctic?
Thank you, Ranking Member. Yeah, China plays the game of go, right? Big, long, strategic vision. Their Polar Silk Road, their shipping lanes, they see the Arctic like they see Africa. This is a region that they would like to have a lot of influence in. There's oil and gas, there's other critical minerals, there's rare earth minerals, and so there are a number of ways to influence a region, militarily, economically. Economically is where they're going, with a over $20 billion investment in the Yamal Peninsula. That's a way to influence the region. So China, in my perspective, is influencing the region and the Polar Silk Road as a resource area for them. It diversifies their energy portfolio. It allows them to influence the dialogue and what's happening in a region, even though they claim to be a near-Arctic nation. So this is long-term. They also are an observer to the Arctic Council, which means they get to speak at the Arctic Council when allowed to influence where they can the dialogue. Not all of it is nefarious, but nevertheless, this is long-term. So we might think in election cycles or in weeks or months or years. The Chinese think in decades. And so if a new ocean is opening, they're going to try every way they can to influence what happens there, governance-wise and also economically.
Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Coffey. Can you explain the significance of Russia's claim that the Northern Sea Route is an internal Russian waterway? How does that impact freedom of navigation concerns?
Russia's claim that the Northern Sea Route is part of its internal waterways is a very dubious claim that's based on a very loose interpretation of Article 234 of UNCLOS, which says that they can put certain restrictions on the navigation and transit in its EEZ due to environmental concerns and other issues. It is not, Russia's claim is not within the norms of international law. As far as I know, the only U.S. ally that has challenged this in terms of a freedom of navigation operation is France. It did so recently, and it transited the Northern Sea Route, a French supply ship, a French naval supply ship. And I think actually, under certain circumstances, when the time is right, the U.S. should also show that it does not recognize Russia's claim that this is an internal waterway and conduct freedom of navigation operations in the region.
Thank you. Interesting. Dr. Harriman, do you believe the United States needs to develop strategic ports in the Arctic?
I think that at present, the port infrastructure and wider infrastructure in port cities isn't built to reap the economic benefits of increased tourism in a sustainable way. We have not invested in that environmental sustainability, both through regulation to ensure that we're not polluting those critical fisheries to our food security and to Alaska fishermen, but we're also not investing in that infrastructure to ensure that when tourists come, that Alaska Native craftswomen and men are able to gain those economic benefits. So increased investment in port cities all across the Arctic, particularly Nome, but I think that that's a key thing that we need to do in the next 5 years.
And so, Dr. Harriman, just so I understand, are you saying that you're supporting it in the future, but not right now because we haven't built the infrastructure yet?
We have not built the infrastructure yet. I think that we need to, as I said in my statement, listen and learn from those who live in these port cities and be guided by those voices. So I think that, investing in those assets before making the large-scale investment in a port, making sure that those cities are well supported and are being led by local voices is the first step before any other major infrastructure investment is taken.
And thank you. I'm almost out of time, so I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Ms. Lesko, and I'd like to recognize Ms. Demings for questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. Unfortunately, our time is limited. They have called votes, but I'd like to ask this question, and whichever one of you feel best prepared, please answer. How would you describe the geopolitical tensions that currently are developing within the region, and what efforts do you believe U.S. allies are engaged in to really foster international cooperation?
Perhaps I could have the first stab at that. As I said, I believe that the level of geopolitical tension in the region is low, especially in a security or military sense. But as we've seen with Russia's actions in other places of the world, Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, things could quickly change. And they seem to have the political will and a willingness to use military force to advance national interests, and I don't think cold weather is going to stop them. So I think we have to plan accordingly, assuming that Russia could act in a belligerent way in the region, especially considering that 5 of the Arctic countries, as I said, are in NATO, and the U.S. is obligated to defend Oslo, Norway, in the same way we're obligated to defend Orlando, Florida. So that needs to be factored into our way of thinking, I believe.
Thank you. Doctor?
Thanks for that question. So in our work on Arctic cooperation, we noted a long history of doing exactly that in the region, and there are many structures and frameworks in place to enable that. And so I don't want to overlook that in this discussion. But as it has already been noted, our work also found that there were very few types of flashpoints or tensions that could arise in the near-term future, at least in the Arctic, because the stakeholders involved benefit from this cooperation economically and in other ways as well. But that said, I do think that one of the items that I mentioned in my testimony is this idea of a security void and nations being able to conduct their roles and responsibilities in the region as they would elsewhere in their territories. And I do think that that is something the U.S. needs to pay attention to moving forward in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Regretfully, I'm going to have to yield back, Mr. Chair, and
Now call Mr. Katko from New York.
Well, I don't regret that you finished early, because now I can ask questions and then go vote. So thank you for accommodating that. And thank you for having this hearing, because it's a really important issue. And one thing I love about Homeland Security, we're generally on the same page all the time, Democrats and Republicans, and this is another example of that. And so I'm just curious, as we're having this whole discussion here, I want to take a step back, because everything I've heard from everybody else I agree with, and we need to increase funding to Coast Guard and get a presence up there that's better and more sustained. But how did this happen? Can we venture an opinion as to how we let our guard down to this extent and allowed Russia to have so much more influence in that area? Why would we do that, especially with our involvement with NATO in those countries? Anybody want to hazard an opinion on that? Mr. Coffey, you want to start?
Sure. Well, I think it goes back to the point I made about the lack of awareness of our role and status as an Arctic power in terms of the policy community and DoD and Department of Homeland Security, but also the inability to have a serious debate about this issue in our number one security alliance, NATO. And this is because of an internal division between Norway and Canada over what role NATO should have in the region. To give you just one example, the NATO strategic concept, its most recent one, which highlights all the future challenges to the alliance, does not even mention the word Arctic once. Literally, it's not found. So that also feeds into our policymaking as well. So perhaps we are a little bit behind the curve because of it's our own fault.
Doctor.
I would agree with that. The U.S. is often called the reluctant Arctic nation, right? We are not at the table as often because we don't view ourselves as an Arctic nation. When you go to Moscow, when you speak with our Russian colleagues, right, they know that they are an Arctic nation. Our U.S. Special Representative to the Arctic, Admiral Papp, that has been an empty office for the past 2 years now. We do not promote ourselves as an Arctic nation. We are thousands of miles away from Alaska, and those voices just aren't heard in these halls. So in order to ensure that those conversations are happening at NATO, I think we first have to fully acknowledge and come to the table as an Arctic nation.
I mean, I know we're talking about the Coast Guard and the Coast Guard's presence and needs for it, but it's also a Department of Defense issue as well. And I'm just dumbfounded as to why we would let this happen. But anybody else want to add anything to that, Doc?
I would add just a few things. As an Alaskan, I have an interesting perspective, perhaps, in that the F-35s will be bedded down at Eielson Air Force Base here in just a little bit, and missile defense is almost exactly 100 miles from my driveway. So we are hypersensitive about what happens across the Bering Strait, what happens in the Indo-Pacific region. I think we have let our guard down as a country for a number of reasons. One, if you go back in history, you look at World War II, where it was reactionary. Alaska was at the spear of a lot of that happened in World War II, so we built an Alcan. We put in more forces there. Then the Cold War happened. During the Cold War, the United States and Russia played a great game under the ice. I mean, and above the air. Still today, we have Russian bombers that have come across and they're escorted out of from international waters. But at the end of the Cold War, there was a reset where we can sort of let our guard down and think about things. And then, of course, as a nation, we were looking elsewhere after 9/11. This now, climate change serves the fourth pillar of this, where we're seeing this ocean open before us. And
I'm going to interrupt you. We're running out of time, and I just want to thank the witnesses today for your comments. We're going to continue to address these issues, and I want to thank the members of the committee also for the questions, and you can add additional questions for the witnesses in writing, and we would ask you to respond to them as well. Without objection, the committee record shall be kept open for 10 days. Seeing no further business, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Good luck getting to